The night sky over Dar es Salaam glows red, not from celebration but from burning polling stations. The air is thick with tear gas. The sound of sirens merges with the rhythmic chants of thousands, no vote, no peace. For decades, Tanzania was the quiet heart of East Africa, the land of Julius Nyerere, a place that once taught the continent that unity and peace could coexist. But tonight, that silence has shattered. This was supposed to be an election day, a symbol of democracy. Instead, it has become a battlefield. President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once praised as a symbol of hope, now stands accused of betraying that very promise. Two major opposition parties have been banned. Their leaders, Tundu, Lissu, and Heche, are in prison. The streets are filled not with voters, but with young Tanzanians holding nothing but flags, courage, and a single demand: give us back our voice. As tanks roll through the streets, something remarkable happens. The people cheer. Soldiers of the Tanzania People's Defense Forces are being greeted not as oppressors, but as saviors. The crowd chants for the army to take over the country, recalling the defiant words of Captain Heche, the officer who weeks ago dared to say, "If our founding father could see this, he would weep." This is not merely an election gone wrong. It is a nation's soul crying out for redemption, and the world is watching. So tonight we ask, when the right to choose is stolen, what remains of democracy? Can a nation built on unity survive when its youth no longer trust the ballot box? Stay with us, because what is unfolding in Tanzania may not just reshape one country, it could redefine the future of African democracy itself. If you believe that truth deserves a voice louder than power, please like, share, and subscribe. Because in moments like this, awareness is more than news, it's resistance. Dawn breaks over Tanzania with smoke still hanging in the air. What should have been a calm and hopeful morning, the kind where citizens line up with ink-stained fingers to cast their ballots, instead begins with barricades, burnt ballots, and a nation divided. The 2025 general election has become a moment of reckoning for millions who no longer believe in the process meant to define their future. At the center of this crisis stands President Samia Suluhu Hassan, once hailed as a moderate reformer, now accused of consolidating power through fear and silence. Her government banned the two major opposition parties Chadema and Act Wazalendo just weeks before the polls opened. The official reason: national security. But for ordinary Tanzanians, it was the final proof that democracy had been replaced by control. In the days leading up to the vote, police arrested dozens of activists, journalists, and even clergy who dared to question the election. When the polls finally opened, the opposition was nowhere to be found. Their leaders, Tundu Lissu, the fiery lawyer who once survived an assassination attempt, and Heche, his loyal deputy, both detained under what many call political imprisonment. In Tarime, their hometown stronghold, polling centers stood deserted, their gates sealed with ashes and anger. By midday, the protests erupted nationwide. Videos began flooding Telegram channels, shaky footage from phones that defied the government's internet shutdown. In Dar es Salaam, thousands of young people gathered near Mwanza Moja grounds, waving handmade banners that read, "We refuse to be ruled by fear." Others carried portraits of Julius Nyerere, the founding father, as if summoning his spirit to witness what his nation had become. Meanwhile, the government doubled down. Heavily armed police were deployed using tear gas and live ammunition. Yet for every street cleared, another one filled up. In Mwanza, students from St. Augustine University locked arms and marched toward the city square. In Arusha, protesters blocked traffic, chanting, "Samia is voting against herself." As tensions rose, reports emerged that the Tanzania People's Defense Forces had been ordered to support the police. Tanks rolled into the streets, but what followed next took everyone by surprise. Rather than running in fear, people cheered. Women ululated, children waved flags, and men climbed atop cars shouting, "Let the army save the people." The image was surreal, a government sending soldiers to control its own citizens, and those very citizens welcoming the soldiers as allies. This shift echoed a speech given just weeks earlier by Captain Heche, a young officer who had publicly criticized the regime. His words, "The army exists to defend the people, not the powerful," had been condemned by the defense chief, but now they seemed prophetic. Across social media, for those still able to connect through VPNs, clips of cheering crowds and soldiers in armored vehicles began circulating under the hashtag #LetUsVote. Within hours, it became a movement. In one striking scene captured near the University of Dar es Salaam, a protester climbed onto a police van holding up a torn ballot paper and shouting into the camera, "This is not democracy. This is dictatorship with a voting booth." That video spread faster than the government could delete it. By nightfall, several polling stations were set ablaze in Tarime and Mwanza. Officials called them isolated incidents, but the symbolism was unmistakable, a rejection of a system that no longer represented the people. As one young protester told a foreign journalist hiding among the crowds, "If they take our voice, we'll make them hear our silence through fire." And so the day that was meant to celebrate democracy instead became its funeral. The ballots were burned, but the spirit of resistance had only just been lit. By the third day of unrest, Tanzania was no longer just a nation in protest, it was a nation at the edge of transformation. The chants that had begun in the narrow streets of Tarime had now spread to Arusha, Dodoma, and Dar es Salaam. Crowds filled the city squares, waving flags, clapping rhythmically, and calling out one name over and over, Tesha, Tesha, Tesha. They were not calling for a politician. They were calling for Captain John Tesha, the young military officer who weeks earlier had risked everything by publicly criticizing the government. His statement, "The founding father Julius Nyerere built this nation for justice, not fear," had earned him suspension from duty. Yet now, Tesha's defiance had become a rallying cry for millions who believed that the true guardians of the nation were no longer in the presidential palace, but in the hearts of ordinary citizens. What began as peaceful demonstrations quickly evolved into an open confrontation between citizens and state authority. Police lines were broken, tear gas clouds scattered by the wind, and in several cities, protesters took control of entire neighborhoods. Videos showed them forming human chains to protect elderly voters and women carrying water for those affected by tear gas. These were not scenes of chaos, they were scenes of reclaiming dignity. In Dar es Salaam, hundreds gathered outside the main courthouse demanding the release of opposition leader Tundu Lissu, chanting, "One man cannot jail a nation." Witnesses say the sound of the crowd was so thunderous that even the police hesitated to advance, and when armored vehicles from the Tanzania People's Defense Forces appeared at the intersection, something extraordinary happened. The protesters didn't run. They raised their hands and the soldiers lowered their rifles. That moment, captured in a dozen shaky videos, would become the image of the uprising civilians and soldiers standing side by side, eyes locked as if silently agreeing that the nation belonged to both. An older woman placed her hand on a soldier's arm and whispered, "You are our sons, not their weapons." He nodded. From that moment, fear began to dissolve. The protests turned into a movement. People painted murals of Captain Tesha across the capital, alongside portraits of Nyerere and Nelson Mandela. Street musicians sang songs comparing the struggle in Tanzania to Burkina Faso's rebellion for sovereignty under President Ibrahim Traoré. "They took their destiny back," one singer said, "and so will we." The government's response grew desperate. State media claimed that foreign influence was behind the unrest. The president addressed the nation briefly, her tone brittle. "We will not allow disorder to destroy the peace our ancestors built." But the speech only fueled more anger. Across social media, Tanzanians mocked the statement with the hashtag "Our peace is justice," which trended across East Africa despite ongoing internet restrictions. In Arusha University, students unfurled a massive banner that read, "You cannot arrest a generation." International attention followed swiftly. Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch condemned the arrests and called for an independent inquiry. The African Union expressed deep concern, while neighboring Kenya urged dialogue before bloodshed. But inside Tanzania, the message was clearer than ever: dialogue was too late. As the fourth night fell, the streets were alive with the sound of drums, whistles, and defiance. Candlelight vigils illuminated murals of Tesha and Lissu. People spoke in hushed but determined voices. "We have no weapons, only truth." And that terrifies them more than any bullet. That night, as soldiers stood quietly among civilians instead of against them, one could feel that Tanzania had reached a point of no return. The protest had become something greater, a mirror held up to power reflecting the will of a generation refusing to be erased. The world was watching, and so were the people of Africa from Ouagadougou to Nairobi, wondering if Tanzania, like Burkina Faso, before it had just taken its first trembling step toward reclaiming true sovereignty. By the end of the first week, Tanzania had changed beyond recognition. The smell of smoke lingered over Dar es Salaam, not only from burnt ballot boxes, but from government buildings now scarred by unrest. Markets were empty, schools shut down, and the city's heartbeat, its buses, vendors, and chatter fell silent. The government declared a state of emergency, claiming that foreign agitators had infiltrated the protests. But no one believed it anymore. Ordinary Tanzanians could see the truth in their own neighborhoods, soldiers standing quietly beside civilians, refusing to fire, refusing to be used. What had started as a protest was now a moral standoff between the people's conscience and the government's fear. Civilian life collapsed into uncertainty. Hospitals filled with the injured students, journalists, and bystanders as supplies ran low. Volunteers turned churches and mosques into makeshift clinics. Women carried food to the front lines, young doctors treated the wounded under candlelight, and priests led prayers in the open streets. For many, it felt less like rebellion and more like survival. The economic impact was immediate. Foreign investors froze projects. Flights were canceled. The Tanzanian shilling fell sharply. The tourism industry, once a lifeline, evaporated overnight. In Arusha, safari lodges closed as guests were evacuated. Small traders watched their savings disappear as markets stayed shuttered. Yet amid the despair, something unexpected began to bloom: solidarity. People formed neighborhood committees to keep order where the state had vanished. Taxi drivers offered free rides for medical emergencies. Local elders gathered nightly to mediate between protesters and security forces. For the first time in decades, Tanzanians were organizing not under a party, but under a shared sense of belonging. Politically, the shockwaves were even deeper. Inside the ruling party, CCM quiet divisions surfaced. Some senior members privately questioned President Suluhu's decisions, warning that the army's neutrality could become the government's downfall. Rumors circulated that a faction within the military sympathetic to Captain Teche's ideals was negotiating behind the scenes to prevent bloodshed. Meanwhile, the opposition's voice, though silenced in prisons, grew louder outside. The image of Tundu Lissu, the imprisoned opposition leader, was painted across the walls of Dar es Salaam with the words, "We still hear you." To the youth, he became a symbol not of politics, but of courage. Internationally, Tanzania's image as a peaceful democracy began to crumble. Human rights organizations compared the government's tactics to Zimbabwe in the early 2000s. East African neighbors expressed alarm, fearing the unrest could spill over borders. Kenyan and Ugandan activists who had once been deported for supporting Tanzanian protesters now coordinated online campaigns calling for sanctions. But perhaps the most profound consequence was psychological. A generation that had grown up believing in quiet obedience had now learned to speak and to resist. Young people, once dismissed as apathetic, had proven that silence was no longer their default. As one protester said to a journalist from Nairobi, "They used to call us lazy, but now they know we are awake." President Samia Suluhu's administration faced its gravest legitimacy crisis. With much of the civil service paralyzed and the electoral process discredited, her next moves would decide whether Tanzania returned to dialogue or descended further into chaos. For many citizens, however, the decision was already made. They no longer looked to the State House for leadership, they looked to each other. In the streets of Mwanza and Morogoro, murals began to appear with a simple message. The government fell the moment the people stood. And in that message lay the essence of Tanzania's transformation, a society rediscovering its power even in the ruins of its democracy. As images of burning polling stations and cheering crowds spread across the internet, the world could no longer look away. What had begun as a local protest in Tanzania had evolved into a regional alarm, and Washington, Brussels, and Addis Ababa were suddenly paying attention. The United States Department of State released a carefully worded statement calling for restraint on all sides and an immediate restoration of democratic order. But within U.S. foreign policy circles, the tone was sharper. Analysts on Capitol Hill compared Tanzania's unrest to a slow-motion democratic collapse, warning that East Africa's most stable nation might now follow the path of Sudan or Burkina Faso, nations where youth movements had overthrown stagnant regimes. American media picked up the story, showing clips of soldiers lowering their weapons as crowds chanted for freedom. On CNN, a retired diplomat said Tanzania has long been the anchor of peace in East Africa. If it unravels, the whole region will feel the tremors. The New York Times ran a headline, "Tanzania's Generation Z takes on the old guard." To many Americans, the images of young people defying tanks evoked memories of Tiananmen Square or even the civil rights marches of the 1960s. In Europe, reactions were divided. The European Union condemned the arrests of opposition figures and suspended non-humanitarian aid pending an independent inquiry. France called for constructive dialogue, while the United Kingdom quietly evacuated some of its citizens. But it was African voices that resonated most powerfully. From Burkina Faso, several journalists and commentators drew parallels between Tanzania's struggle and their own journey toward sovereignty under President Ibrahim Traoré. In an op-ed published in Ouagadougou, one writer asked, "When the ballot is no longer sacred, rebellion becomes a form of truth." Across African social media, the hashtags #Tanzania uprising and #Africa awakening began trending together. Young Africans from Ghana, Nigeria, and South Africa posted messages of solidarity, sharing photos of Tanzanian protesters with captions like "Different country, same struggle." At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, emergency discussions were held. The AU's Peace and Security Council urged dialogue and respect for constitutional order. Yet privately, many diplomats admitted the crisis reflected a deeper issue: the widening rift between Africa's youth and its aging leadership. Even China and Russia, two of Tanzania's key economic partners, issued cautious statements emphasizing stability and respect for national sovereignty. But their silence on the human cost spoke louder than words. Meanwhile, the African diaspora in the United States organized rallies outside Tanzanian embassies, waving both Tanzanian flags and placards bearing the face of Captain Heche. One protester told reporters in Washington, "We grew up hearing that Tanzania was Africa's peace capital. Now peace has turned into silence, and silence is complicity." In think tanks from Washington to Brussels, one question dominated policy discussions: could the Tanzanian crisis trigger a new wave of political awakening across Africa? And perhaps more unsettling, would it inspire other militaries to side with the people as had happened in Burkina Faso? In that possibility lay the true unease of Western powers. Because what was happening in Tanzania was not just about one election, it was about the collapse of the illusion that democracy imposed from outside could survive without justice within. As the dust begins to settle over Dar es Salaam, one truth remains: Tanzania has crossed a threshold it cannot return from. The ballots have burned, but so too has the illusion that democracy can exist without accountability. What began as a call for fair elections has become something far deeper, a moral awakening that neither tear gas nor decrees can silence. Across the country, murals of Captain Heche, Tundu, Lissu, and even Julius Nyerere have appeared on walls once painted with campaign slogans. Children pass by them on their way to school, whispering their names with quiet pride. For many, it is a reminder that heroes are not only found in textbooks, they are born in the streets when ordinary people refuse to bow. But the road ahead is uncertain. The government clings to power, hoping fatigue will wear down resistance. Yet every day, more Tanzanians realize that the struggle is no longer about a single election, it's about the very idea of freedom itself. And that realization is spreading beyond Tanzania's borders. From Ouagadougou to Nairobi, from Bamako to Kampala, the same question echoes: what good is democracy when people cannot choose? In Burkina Faso, President Ibrahim Traoré once warned that Africa's greatest battle would not be fought with guns but with consciousness, the fight to liberate minds. Perhaps what we are witnessing in Tanzania is the beginning of that battle taking shape, a generation unwilling to be ruled by fear or foreign definitions of governance. For the international community, this moment is more than a crisis, it's a test. Will the world support Africans when they rise not against each other, but against the systems that have failed them? Or will it turn away as it has so many times before until the next rebellion demands to be noticed? To our viewers watching from afar from Washington, Atlanta, or London, this story is not just about Tanzania. It's about the universal struggle between power and truth control and conscience. And it asks a question that concerns us all. When people stand up for justice, will we stand with them or remain comfortably silent? If you believe that awareness is the first step toward justice, if you believe that Africa's story deserves to be told by those living it, not those profiting from it, please share this video. Subscribe if you believe that truth is more important than headlines. Comment below. Do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's call for Africa's mental liberation is already happening in Tanzania today? Because the future of democracy, not just in Tanzania, but across Africa, will depend on how we answer that question.